Hi everyone, this is the second part of my two-part sequence on price discrimination. This video will discuss the potential antitrust issues associated with price discrimination. One of the big themes in this video is that in hindsight, the Supreme Court doesn't always make the best economic decisions when it comes to some of these landmark antitrust cases. Recall that we discussed how collusion is always illegal due to the Sherman Act, while the Robinson-Patman Act says that price discrimination is illegal when it leads to anti-competitive results. To be sure, unlike collusion, price discrimination is not always illegal. The first video covered some legal examples of price discrimination, such as Comcast offering a bundle discount on cable services, or the Orioles offering a student discount to Friday home games. So the key thing to keep in mind is, when is price discrimination illegal? Well, that comes down to whose side are you on. Do you want to protect competitors, or do you want to protect competition? They sound similar, but as we will find out, they mean different things. This video covers two landmark Supreme Court cases on price discrimination, one related to primary line injury and the other associated with secondary line injury. So what's the difference? Recall that I can simplify the supply chain for any product into three steps: raw materials, manufacturing, and retail. Suppose that a manufacturer is engaging in a price discrimination strategy. Primary line injury is when a rival manufacturer is harmed by that action. On the other hand, secondary line injury is when a retailer is harmed by the partnership between the price discriminating manufacturer and a rival retailer. First up, we have an example of primary line injury. The Utah Pie case is infamous because, as we'll see, the economic rationale used was flawed. So here's the background story. There were three big frozen dessert pie companies selling in Salt Lake City in the 1950s: Carnation, Continental Baking, and Pet Milk. All three of these companies were based in California. That will be an important detail in a second. So they're making their pies in California and distributing them and selling them in Salt Lake City. So then a new entrant comes in called Utah Pie, and they priced so aggressively that they were able to gain instant success. Recall from the Perfect Competition chapter that entry should lead to lower prices, so nothing surprising was going on with the impact of Utah Pie's entry. But because Utah Pie was more of a local store only in Salt Lake City and not in California, the three incumbent companies lowered their prices just for Salt Lake City customers and didn't necessarily lower their price for California customers. So this is an example of price discrimination because Salt Lake City customers are paying a different price than California customers for the same frozen dessert pie. Well, Utah Pie claimed that this was illegal because it made it harder for them to sell pie. Utah Pie enters in 1957, and because they entered with a price lower than what any of the incumbents charged, they quickly grabbed a whopping 67% market share. Think about that. They went from not even existing to dominating the local market in the span of just 1 year. Anyways, the incumbent frozen dessert pie companies respond by lowering their price, and so you can see that Utah Pie's market share dropped in 1959. Fast forward to 1961, and Utah Pie is still about half the market in Salt Lake City. So is this an example of primary line injury? Has a rival manufacturer, Utah Pie, been harmed by an illegal price discrimination practice? Surprisingly, the Supreme Court said yes. Now, it's important to think about who wins and who loses from this example of price discrimination. First and foremost, consumers should consider price discrimination a win. Not only do they have more options in the form of an additional pie maker, but they're paying lower prices than they once did. I take that all day, any day. You could argue that price discrimination was a win for the incumbent firms because their market shares were able to rally, and the three companies combined for a higher market share in 1961 than in 1958. But don't forget that they were doing much better before Utah Pie came around in 1957, so they're not exactly rejoicing. So who really was harmed here? Well, Utah Pie was able to convince the Supreme Court that they were the losers here, since their market share went down following the incumbent's price cut, which again is what economists expect would happen with entry. Ultimately, the Supreme Court feared that there would be a domino effect if the alleged harm forced Utah Pie out of business, even though they still captured about half the market and in the end never was forced to exit the market. To be sure, the Supreme Court's decision was not unanimous, and in the dissenting opinion, Justice Stewart opined that the court misinterpreted the Robinson-Patman Act by protecting competitors instead of competition. Again, who really lost here? Just Utah Pie. But competition was stronger since the market shares were a little bit more evenly distributed, and consumers were happier due to entry and the corresponding lower prices. And so the legacy of this case is that the court got this one wrong. It doesn't make sense to prioritize the protection of just one company over competition that has become less concentrated, or most importantly, the welfare of consumers. In this particular case, it doesn't look like anything illegal actually happened. Let's go from one frustrating court case to another. This is the Morton Salt case, which is an example of secondary line injury. Again, this is when a manufacturer is engaging in price discrimination and the anti-competitive effect occurs at the retail level. So the manufacturer in this case was Morton Salt, which as we still know today, manufactures table salt. They engaged in second-degree price discrimination by offering a quantity discount to retailers based on the amount of salt that they buy. Similar to the Buffalo Wild Wings example in the previous video, the idea behind Morton Salt's quantity discount program was to lower the price per case if grocery stores bought a larger volume of salt. I've tried to Google how to compare the amount of salt in a 5,000 case versus a carload, but I haven't been able to figure that out. Suffice it to say that 5,000 cases is larger than a carload, so that's why a retailer would get a 10-cent discount per case for the increased purchase. It is important to note that no retailer was given preferential treatment regarding the quantity discount, and so all retailers were eligible for the same discounts outlined in the previous slide. However, only 5 large grocery chains bought enough salt to qualify for the steepest discounts. So rival retailers claimed that this quantity discount was anti-competitive because these 5 companies were able to gain an allegedly unfair advantage with this price discrimination strategy. For a product with razor-thin margins like salt, a 5 or 10 cent difference was substantial. In their defense, Morton Salt claimed that this whole thing is no big deal since all we're talking about is salt, and salt is not a big moneymaker for grocery stores, and we're just talking about 5 cents here or 5 cents there anyways. Well, the Supreme Court dismissed that argument, saying that what's more important is that anti-competitive effects occurred regardless of the market size. More interestingly, the court interpreted the Robinson-Patman Act as being relevant even if the possibility of an anti-competitive effect might occur. That's a pretty low bar if you ask me. So at the end of the day, the Supreme Court determined that equal availability of quantity discounts was not sufficient, but instead equal functionality must occur. But then this price discrimination strategy would be useless if the firm can't provide the appropriate incentives for customers to buy more from them. Anyways, it's important to remember that this case was from 1948 and that the Supreme Court's view on this issue has evolved since then. But nonetheless, price discrimination cases can't be argued without bringing up either the Utah Pie or the Morton Salt case, which is why I presented them in this class. Now that you're done with the 2-part sequence, I encourage you to review the practice problems that I provided on Moodle to make sure that you fully understand the concepts introduced in these recordings. Remember that I also provide the solutions to these ungraded problems and that the purpose of these exercises is to give you an idea of the types of questions you might see on the final exam. As always, feel free to email me with any questions you have.